Hello, YouTube. I'm back with one of my rare videos that is not a music review or otherwise music related. I am an occasional booktuber as well as someone who just shares weird thoughts, who shares interesting thoughts I sometimes have. And if you do not like that somewhat eccentric variety, sue me. So, in the one thing I've talked about in the past on this channel is the subject of religion, and I guess my personal lack thereof. So, I thought that would be a fun topic to revisit. But how did I get to today's book? Well, as part of my family's Passover Seder, we read from this annotated Haggadah, so that's the book that guides one through the Seder ceremony. And inevitably, we always end up reading essays in the Haggadah about how God's behavior in the Passover story is quite troubling because, well, he, spoiler alert, kills the firstborn child of every non-Jewish Egyptian. And look, on the one hand, it's a relief that that essay is in the book and part of our ceremony because it would not be fun for one's tradition to just be totally cool with capital punishment and indiscriminate murder. And while I'm glad that that idea is part of Jewish tradition, it still raised the question for me, how is it even compatible with the tradition? You know, if Judaism teaches that God is this all-powerful, morally perfect being, how does the idea of questioning God's actions even fit into a more observant Jewish context? So my mother responded to this question by saying, my sense of God as a perfect being was more Christian than Jewish. As she understood it, and I guess I'm paraphrasing her, maybe she would put things differently. The God of the Jewish Bible is not a perfect being. You know, he's very much like one of the vengeful Greek gods, powerful, but also clearly incredibly flawed. What my mother tried to make the case of is that the history of Judaism is not one about worshiping God because we actually believe he is morally perfect, but largely observant Jews worship God because of tradition. And in Judaism, there is a separation between actual deep moral analysis and religious ritual. So the act of worship and saying God is perfect, yada, 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 is more about the ritual and it doesn't reflect the moral nuance of the actual religious tradition. Now, I'd never heard this framing before. You know, I thought pretty much all the monotheisms or the Abrahamic religions shared in common the view that God was morally perfect. So this made me want to look for a book on Jewish philosophy and theology, and this is the one I came across. It's called The Jewish God Question by a guy named Andrew Pessin. So Pessin is a philosophy professor at Connecticut College. He's written numerous books for popular consumption, including one just called The God Question about the history of philosophers and God. And he wrote this one specialized on Jewish philosophers and what they have to say about God, again called The Jewish God Question. Now, another big part of Pessin's public persona is that he is an advocate for the state of Israel and critical of campus culture around this stuff. This is something I disagree with him on quite strongly. That's not something I'm going to get into. It's not particularly relevant to this book. There are a few chapters on here on Zionism, but it's mostly from a sort of historical, philosophical, theological lens. So just putting that out there in case anyone raises the topic. So let's talk about actually what's in this book. And I'm going to start off with hinting at what's sort of my problem with how it's structured. So this book basically follows pretty much the entire history of Jewish theological, philosophical thought, starting with a guy named Philo, who was born in 25 BC, and going up to a guy named Samuel Labans, who was born in the 1980s. So this book takes each philosopher and sums up their ideas in pretty much exactly 2 pages each time. And at first, it's actually quite confusing to read because though it's not quite written in the first person, basically Pessin takes on the perspective of each philosopher. He writes about their ideas as if he's actually advocating those ideas himself in each chapter. So it's a slightly unusual style. And for the most part, he will dedicate 2 pages to a thinker and then move on to the next figure as we gradually move from, 2000 years ago to the present. Occasionally, a thinker will get more than one chapter, Maimonides or Baruch Spinoza, some of the really big ones. But for the most part, this is just like flipping through a dictionary of thinkers. As such, I have almost no memory of the individuals and what they stood for in this book, even though I just read it. And again, it's because the experience is so overwhelming. What my mind does is I kind of just blur it all together. And what I got out of this book was a sort of more general dialectic of Jewish theological history. That said, as hinted in the afterword of this book, that may kind of be the point. There's a whole metaphor about how monotheism, like Judaism, is not about worshiping statues, but sort of searching for one ultimate truth. So rather than just rote memorizing, this is the name of a thinker, this is when he was born, this is when he died, this is what he said, but instead of sort of conceptually grouping it all together, in a way, that's the point of this book. Though I'm sure as an academic, Andrew Pessin might like readers to go through it more slowly and use a notebook and actually remember the names of these thinkers, which is something I ultimately failed to do. So as for that dialectic I got out of this book, this progression of Jewish thought, well, right away it starts by emphasizing that a core belief in Judaism is belief in God. And when writing about the early thinkers, it explains how they made the case for why God must exist. Now, I can't say I was quite impressed with these proofs. I mean, I don't know if I would be impressed with any proof, but it feels little different than being preached to by some evangelical Christian conservative. Basically the argument is, well, everything has to come from somewhere, therefore there must be God. And we as atheists say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't solve the problem because then where does God come from? You're just adding one more piece to what is admittedly a very intriguing mystery. But one impression I got, and maybe I'm projecting here, but I don't think so entirely, is that the reason these philosophers made these somewhat unconvincing arguments for why God must exist is they were starting from a place of tradition. Their religion is defined by there being this one God. So rather than them having to come up with these airtight proofs, they just have to come up with good enough proofs because their tradition limits them. And the ideas become much more interesting when rather than just accepting them as having to be perfect proofs, one says, okay, these thinkers had to believe in God, so they had to come up with an idea system to back that up as best they could. And this impression was reaffirmed when gradually the various philosophers started talking about the subject of free will. So, from a certain secular perspective, free will doesn't exist because at the end of the day, we're just collections of molecules engaged in various chemical interactions. And if you actually think about how we engage in the world as substances, it's not like we truly have two choices and can equally act on both anytime. Whereas in many religious traditions, including Judaism and some of the Christian traditions, the idea that God said we had free will is very important to their moral analysis. So, what did the Jewish thinkers do? Well, they felt compelled to say that free will exists because it's such a fundamental part of their tradition. But when you read their arguments, it doesn't come across as if they're oblivious to or dismissive of the atheist perspective. In a way, it seems like on some level they believe it. But what they do is come up with arguments that say, well, we have the illusion of free will in our heads, and it's really all that matters for the human experience. So, that's an interesting argument because it doesn't sound like it's affirming the concept of free will, but the thinker who said it felt he was affirming the concept of free will. And so that seems to be the interesting place some of these ideas come from. More broadly speaking, many of these early Jewish philosophers tried to reconcile their religion with their non-Jewish intellectual heroes. So Aristotle was a huge one, and later Immanuel Kant was another one. So what this shows is that a big part of the Jewish intellectual tradition isn't just, scanning the Bible and saying, what does the Bible say? Rather, it means asking these necessary metaphysical questions. What does there mean for there to be a God? If this God is not a physical being, but a spiritual being, what does that mean? What would it look like if this God is all powerful? Can we describe an all powerful being, or does that necessarily mean compartmentalizing them, which leads to polytheism, which is anathema to Judaism? How could one possibly capture the characteristics of such a being if any description will be limited by the limits of human imagination? So All of these philosophical questions created an interesting dilemma, as it basically led thinkers to more and more just see God as synonymous with the whole universe, with all of everything. And this basically collapses into Baruch Spinoza's view that is basically atheism. Spinoza, the one figure I sort of remember from this, took old Jewish thought and became the founder, or at least the celebrity founder, of the modern non-religious Jewish tradition, which I would count myself as a part of. Now, after the book writes about Spinoza, most, though not all of the thinkers, it talks about do seem to come from a somewhat more religious perspective. But they all broadly commit to this idea of a very vast, abstract notion of God, a God where sort of everything about him is entirely absolute, because that is necessary of an all-powerful monotheist deity. And one assumption that comes from this is the idea that God's love is universal, that God's relationship to all people is the same. But then one of the thinkers shows up and says, well, what if we go back and read the Bible? And the Bible not only says God is the special relationship with the Jewish people, but that this special relationship came from God's singular relationship with Abraham, that Abraham was God's best friend. Now, this philosopher makes this interesting case that love is actually more powerful if it is not universal, but love for a particular person, because then that comes with specificity. It comes with a specific choice to love a specific person. And thus, this thinker tries to make the sense that actually would make sense that a perfect godly love would be specialized and not universal. But again, it shows this interesting dilemma where basically Judaism is stuck in this challenging cycle of contradiction. Our tradition, on the one hand, compels observant Jews to believe in God, and it encourages them to understand God through being intellectually rigorous. But as one thinks about God in a philosophical way, that kind of pulls one away from the stories that are actually in the Bible, the core of that text, where supposedly our notion of God comes from. So, what does it mean to be Jewish? Does it mean believing in the God as described in the Bible, or just accepting the core precept that there is one God and then thinking philosophically about what one God would actually be like? So when I put all of the ideas in this book together, I feel like the argument it kind of adds up to is that what it means to be Jewish is just engaging in the constant struggle to be Jewish. So for some, that means following traditional religious laws and believing in God. But one could also make a strong case that from that original religious belief in God tradition, there's a natural intellectual pathway towards atheism, and secular Judaism is an equally valid way of being Jewish, because if we take our ideas seriously, they don't ultimately support the idea of a personal you know Bible style God. So the very last thinker in this book is a guy named Samuel Liebens. And I remember finding his chapter very interesting. I certainly have to reread it because, I'm new to philosophy, but basically makes this case that if God is all powerful, how could God not possibly take up all of the space in the universe? The very idea of creation necessarily means, an area of the universe where God's control is somewhat limited, where these lesser beings can operate. And this book repeatedly uses this phrase "tzimtzum," which is this idea from the Kabbalistic tradition of Judaism, which says that God necessarily minimized his power in order to allow for creation. But regardless, this is a troubling idea for monotheism. And it seems like the model Samuel Liebens comes up with to explain this is that we are all just a dream in God's head, that God does take up all the space in the universe, and the only way creation can exist is as like a figment of God's imagination. So this feels like some cool, abstract, hippie way of engaging with religion. But then I looked up who Samuel Liebens was, and it turns out he's an Orthodox rabbi. So, not some secular Jew trying to find a fun way to engage with the tradition of his ancestors, but someone who continues to be an observant Jew to this day. And this in turn made me think of a debate I recently watched between the popular young atheist Alex O'Connor and the Catholic bishop and public educator Robert Barron. And in this debate, Barron quotes one of his colleagues, whose name I unfortunately don't remember, where he says something along the lines of, whenever I debate atheists, I tell them that if God were what they believed, then I wouldn't believe in that God either. And Bishop Barron explains the idea that in Catholicism, God is not this man with a beard in the clouds, but some sort of more abstract entity beyond our comprehension. And Bishop Barron's point, along with reading Samuel Liebens, again, this Orthodox rabbi, supposedly someone who's very committed to the idea of belief in God, made me wonder how different atheists and at least the more intellectual religious folk really are. If to many religious folk, God is this non-material being whose vastness makes him beyond our comprehension, is that really so different from the atheist worldview? I mean, I guess it's not absolutely atheist, but I think it's certainly compatible with agnosticism. So, yeah, I guess these are the kind of questions I got from reading this book. And again, I feel like there's a lot I didn't retain. I didn't remember the names of a lot of these thinkers. I mean, Hannah Arendt shows up in here and I knew her, but she was kind of out of place because, it just discussed her writing on the banality of evil. She's not really doing religious philosophy. It mentions someone named Judith Plesko as the founder of feminist Judaism. But yeah, I feel like a lot of the older figures, Gersonides, Kreska, I don't know if Rabad showed up here. So many names. I mean, I even sort of lost sense of who Maimonides was conceptually. So I'd love to go back at some point and actually zone in on who some of these thinkers are. But I certainly appreciated the sort of thought journey I went on from reading all these thinkers in concert, and I'd be interested to hear what other people think. Was my mother's idea that in Judaism, the tradition of belief versus Jewish moral analysis are very separate things? Does that hold up? I kind of felt it did, but I also felt like you're not directly allowed to say that. Like the observant Jews who do insist they believe in God, I don't know if they'd say, well, we believe in him, but we're not really cool with his morality. We think he was a bad Greek style God in the Passover story. I think they'd find much more careful ways to make that point. So I don't know. Let me know your thoughts, and I hope you appreciated this review. And I look forward to talking about what I'm reading sometime down the road.